You know, I've learned something about dignity. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand to be recognized. And it doesn't break down when someone half your age forgets what respect looks like. It stands there, silent, waiting for the right moment to speak. That moment came to me one evening, a family reunion that was supposed to be a celebration, but ended up teaching me something far deeper about human pride, generational arrogance, and the quiet strength of patience. It began on a bright Saturday afternoon. The air was sweet with the scent of grilled food and flowers. I watched as people filled the garden, my daughter's friends, relatives I hadn't seen in years, children running between tables. It should have felt like homecoming. It didn't. I'd helped make this reunion happen. I'd offered the estate my estate for it. Years ago, when I retired from my company, I bought this old place on the outskirts of town, restored it, and occasionally rented it out for weddings or family events. It was my way of keeping busy, staying useful. When my daughter asked if she could host her reunion here, I didn't hesitate. I said yes, gladly, but I didn't expect her husband, my son-in-law, Daniel, to treat me like an inconvenient relic from a black and white photograph. He greeted everyone with wide arms and loud laughter. When I approached smiling, he barely looked at me. I extended my hand. He brushed past me, saying something like, "Let's get the old folks seated before they get tired." Yeah, it was a small thing. But small things cut the deepest. The people nearby laughed, politely. I laughed too, pretending I hadn't felt the sting. You see, that's the strange thing about family. It's the only group that can humiliate you without meaning to. You swallow it because you tell yourself it's love. I sat by the edge of the patio, under a large oak tree, watching them all. Daniel strutted around like a king. My daughter followed him, laughing too loudly, avoiding my eyes. I could tell she was embarrassed, but she wouldn't say it. She'd learned to keep the peace, even if it meant breaking her father's heart a little. As the evening stretched on, I became invisible. People passed my table without seeing me. I was there, but somehow, I wasn't part of the frame anymore. And that's when the conversation that changed everything began. Daniel raised his glass and started telling a story, some anecdote about how young people today are smarter, faster, more adaptable. He said it with the confidence of a man who's never had to bury a dream or rebuild a life after loss. Then he laughed and said, "No offense, but old people just don't get it anymore. They're stuck in their ways, can't keep up." A few chuckles. Some heads turned toward me, polite smiles, pity in their eyes. My daughter looked down. I remember touching the rim of my glass, feeling the condensation, and thinking, it's fascinating how people measure worth by novelty. Old people, he said it like a disease, like something contagious that he was determined to outgrow. I've spent most of my life building things, companies, relationships, principles. I've been through recessions, wars, and heartbreaks. I've made mistakes and paid for them with years, not just regrets. And yet, in one sentence, he reduced all that to irrelevance. But I didn't respond, not yet, because sometimes silence is more eloquent than anger. You see, I own the place. Every chair, every light, every inch of that carefully mowed lawn belonged to me. The event manager had my number, my approval, and when I saw the staff glance my way for a moment, uncertain whether to refill the wine or wait, something inside me clicked. It wasn't revenge that stirred in me, it was reclamation. Later that night, when the music was loud and people were dancing, I stood and walked slowly across the lawn. The grass shimmered under the string lights. I caught the manager's eye near the sound booth. I gave a small nod. The music stopped. The lights dimmed. For a few seconds, confusion rippled through the crowd like a gust of cold wind. Daniel turned, looking around. "What happened?" he asked. The manager pointed at me. I could feel 100 eyes on me. I didn't rush. I walked to the center of the garden, feeling strangely calm. "Evening, everyone," I said, my voice steady. "I'm sorry to interrupt. There's been a small change of plans." Silence. "You see," I continued, "this venue isn't available tonight anymore. The owner has decided to cancel the event." Laughter, nervous at first, then silence again when they realized I wasn't joking. Daniel's face went pale. "You can't do that," he said, half laughing. "You don't own the..." I looked at him, and something in my eyes must have told him the truth. I do. I said simply, I own this place, and I think I've seen enough for one night. He stared at me, speechless. My daughter looked like she wanted to disappear. I felt sorry for her, not because she'd married him, but because she'd forgotten that kindness has more value than youth ever will. The guests began murmuring, some gathering their things awkwardly. A few older relatives came to shake my hand quietly, respectfully. One of them whispered, "You did the right thing. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't." But that night, I walked back into my house alone, poured myself a drink, and sat by the window. The sound of cars leaving echoed in the distance, and I thought about time, how strange it is, how it changes our place in the world. When you're young, you think you own the future. When you're old, you realize you only rent it for as long as others remember your name. Daniel's arrogance wasn't unusual. It was cultural. Western society worships youth. We talk about progress, but what we really mean is novelty, the shiny, the new, the fast. We confuse energy with wisdom, motion with meaning. But the truth is, most of what sustains civilization was built by hands now wrinkled and slow. The bridges, the systems, the laws, all of them came from people who were once dismissed as old. I realized that night that I wasn't angry at him. I was angry at the world that raised him to believe that age is an expiration date on relevance. And I realized something else. Power doesn't always come from what you control. Sometimes it comes from what you can afford to let go. I could have ruined him that night, embarrassed him publicly, made a spectacle, but I didn't. I simply ended the moment. I reminded everyone that the ground they danced on wasn't theirs to disrespect. The next morning, my daughter came to see me. She was quiet at first. Then she said, "Dad, you didn't have to do that." I smiled. "Maybe not, but I did." She sighed. "He's humiliated." I looked out the window. The sunlight cut through the curtains like mercy. "Good," I said. "Humiliation, when deserved, is a mirror. It shows us who we are without the mask." She didn't reply, but when she left, she hugged me tighter than she had in years. That was enough. It's been a while since that day. I've thought about it often, not with pride, but with clarity. Sometimes standing up for yourself isn't about shouting. It's about quietly reclaiming your place in a world that forgets how much you've given it. Age isn't a weakness. It's the tax you pay for surviving, and every wrinkle is a receipt. I tell this story not because I want sympathy. I tell it because too many men my age sit silently in rooms full of noise, pretending they don't hear the laughter that excludes them. They tell themselves it's just how things are now, but respect isn't generational, it's universal, and the moment we stop demanding it, we lose a part of our humanity. So, to anyone who's ever been dismissed, overlooked, or pushed aside for being old, remember this: you don't need to prove your relevance to those who can't see it. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is remind them, gently, of where they stand. I still host events here sometimes. But every time I walk through those doors, I remember that night, the silence, the faces, the small, quiet dignity of a man who refused to be erased. Because that's what dignity really is, not the absence of humiliation, but the refusal to let humiliation define you. And maybe that's what growing old truly means, not fading, but knowing when to walk away and when to let silence speak louder than anything else ever could. In a world that worships the new, wisdom becomes rebellion, and sometimes the quietest man in the room is the only one still holding the truth. Let me take you back further, to understand how a man arrives at a moment like that, to understand the years that built the foundation strong enough to support such a stand. You don't simply wake up one day with the courage to shut down your own daughter's celebration. That kind of resolve is forged over decades, tempered by loss, sharpened by observation, and finally released when the alternative becomes more painful than action itself. I was born in a different era, one that people today speak of with a mixture of nostalgia and dismissal. We didn't have the internet, the instant gratification, the 1,000 channels of distraction. What we had was time, time to think, time to build, time to understand that worth wasn't measured in likes or shares, but in what you left behind when you were gone. My father was a carpenter, a man who spoke more with his hands than his mouth. He taught me that every joint, every corner, Every surface you create speaks about who you are long after your voice has faded. I watched him build houses that still stand today, decades after he's been in the ground. That's legacy, not the flash of momentary relevance, but the quiet persistence of quality. I carried those lessons into my own life, into the business I built from nothing but determination and a willingness to outwork everyone around me. It wasn't glamorous. There were no viral moments, no overnight success stories. Just years of showing up before dawn, making decisions that kept people employed, taking risks that aged me faster than time alone ever could. When I met Elena, my wife, I was 32 and already graying at the temples. She used to joke that I was born old, that I had the soul of someone who'd lived multiple lifetimes. Maybe she was right. We married in a small ceremony, nothing like the elaborate productions people stage today, and built our life with the same patience my father had taught me. Every achievement was incremental, every milestone earned through persistence rather than luck. Our daughter came late, after years of trying, after Elena had almost given up hope. When they placed that tiny, wrinkled baby in my arms, I remember thinking that I finally understood what my father had meant when he said, "You don't build for yourself. You build for what comes after." I named her Claire after Elena's mother, and I promised myself I would give her everything I'd never had: security, education, choices. I worked harder after she was born, expanded the business, made investments that sometimes kept me awake at night with worry. But I did it because that's what fathers do. We shoulder weight so our children can walk lighter. Claire grew up comfortable, perhaps too comfortable. She never saw the struggles, never knew the nights when I wasn't sure if I could make payroll, never understood that the house she grew up in represented 1,000 small victories over circumstance. How could she? I'd built walls around her made of my own sacrifice, and those walls were so well constructed, she never saw the storms they were designed to weather. Elena used to warn me, "You're making it too easy for her." She'd say, watching me solve every problem before Claire even knew it existed. "She needs to struggle a little. That's how people learn their own strength." But I couldn't help myself. When you fought for everything, there's a deep satisfaction in giving freely. I thought I was showing love. Maybe I was just showing off. Claire went to a good college, studied marketing, graduated with honors and minimal debt because I'd been planning for her education since before she was born. She moved to the city, got a job at a firm that sounded impressive when she described it at family dinners. Elena and I were proud, the way parents are when their children surpass their own achievements. We'd done it. We'd given her a better start than we'd had. Isn't that the dream? Then Elena got sick. It started with fatigue she dismissed as stress, then progressed to tests, then diagnoses, then treatments that ravaged her body while barely slowing the disease. I watched the strongest woman I'd ever known shrink into someone I barely recognized, and there was nothing my money or my connections or my willingness to work harder could do to stop it. For the first time in my life, I was powerless. Claire came home when she could, on weekends mostly, sometimes just for an afternoon. She'd sit by her mother's bed, holding her hand, crying quietly. But she always had to leave, back to work, back to her life, back to the world that didn't stop just because ours was ending. I didn't blame her. The young have to keep moving. It's only the old who have the luxury of staying still, of sitting vigil, of measuring time in breaths instead of achievements. Elena died on a Tuesday morning in October. The leaves were changing, and she'd always loved the death that looked like celebration. Her last words to me were, "Take care of her, but let her fall sometimes. She needs to know she can get back up." I promised, even though I didn't fully understand what she meant. Not then. The funeral was well attended. Claire organized most of it, and I was grateful because I couldn't seem to make even simple decisions. She was efficient, capable, handling details I couldn't focus on. Daniel came with her. They'd been dating for about 6 months by then. He wore an expensive suit and said the right things, but there was something in his manner I couldn't quite identify. A performance of empathy rather than the real thing. But grief makes you suspicious of everything, so I dismissed my instincts as unfair. After Elena died, the house became too quiet. Every room echoed with her absence. I'd find myself setting 2 places at the table, then staring at the extra plate like an idiot. Work had been my refuge for decades, but I'd already begun transitioning leadership to younger partners. Preparing for a retirement, Elena and I had planned to spend traveling. Now those plans were ash, and the business didn't need me the way it once had. I felt untethered, floating in a life that no longer had clear direction. That's when I bought the estate. It was a foreclosure, a once grand property that had fallen into disrepair through a combination of bad luck and worse management. The main house needed everything: new roof, updated electrical, plumbing that didn't sound like dying animals when you turned on a faucet. The grounds were overgrown, the gardens wild, the outbuildings collapsing under the weight of neglect. Everyone told me I was crazy. "You're supposed to be retiring," my business partner said, "not taking on a project that would challenge a man half your age." But that's exactly why I needed it. I needed something to build, to restore, to pour my energy into. I needed to prove I could still create something from ruin. I spent 2 years on that estate, working alongside contractors during the day and planning renovations late into the night. I learned about historical preservation, about period, appropriate materials, about the patience required to restore rather than simply replace. The work was exhausting and expensive and exactly what I needed. Every room I brought back to life felt like a small victory over the entropy that had taken Elena. Every garden bed I cleared felt like proof I could still make something beautiful. When it was finished, the estate was stunning, a venue worthy of the celebrations it would host. I started renting it out, partly for income, but mostly because I couldn't stand the thought of all that space sitting empty. I wanted it filled with life, with laughter, with the milestones that mark a life well lived. Weddings, anniversaries, reunions, I hosted them all, and each one reminded me that joy persists even when your own has dimmed. Claire visited occasionally, less frequently as time went on. She was building her career, then planning her wedding to Daniel, then settling into married life. I understood. The young move forward while the old tend what's behind. That's the natural order, but I noticed changes in her. The easy laughter I remembered from her childhood became more measured, more controlled. She developed a way of speaking that sounded like she was always addressing a client, even when talking to her father. Daniel's influence, I suspected, though I never said so. He was climbing in his firm, one of those financial companies that everyone's heard of, but no one can quite explain what they do. He spoke constantly about disruption and innovation and other buzzwords that seemed designed to make traditional business sound obsolete. At family dinners, which became increasingly rare, he'd dominate conversations with stories of his successes, his deals, his insights into markets and trends. Claire would watch him with pride, and I'd watch her watching him, wondering when she'd started measuring her worth by his achievements. I tried to connect with him, to find common ground. I'd ask about his work, his family, his interests outside the office, but every conversation felt like a transaction he was trying to win. When I'd mention my own business experience, he'd nod politely while his eyes glazed over, as if anything that happened before smartphones couldn't possibly be relevant. Once, I made the mistake of offering advice about a business decision he was wrestling with. I'd dealt with something similar decades earlier, and the lesson seemed universal enough to share. He listened with a thin smile, then said, "Yeah, but things are different now. The old playbook doesn't really apply anymore." The old playbook. As if wisdom has an expiration date, as if the fundamentals of trust, value, and human nature somehow evolved when the internet was invented. I let it go. You learn, after enough years, that some people have to touch the hot stove themselves before they believe it burns. But the dismissals accumulated. Small comments about how things used to be done versus how we do things now. Jokes about technology that positioned anyone over 50 as hopelessly behind. Casual remarks about retirement that made it sound like, I'd been put out to pasture rather than choosing to step back. None of it was overtly cruel. That was the insidious part. It was all wrapped in humor, in generational banter, in the assumption that of course I understood I was from a different time. And because Claire never objected, because she'd laugh along or change the subject, I began to wonder if I was being oversensitive. Maybe this was just how younger people talked. Maybe I needed to develop thicker skin, to accept that my relevance had an expiration date I'd already passed. Eleanor would have shut it down immediately. She had a gift for addressing disrespect so swiftly and completely that people didn't even realize they'd been corrected. But Eleanor was gone, and I'd never developed her talent for confrontation. I'd always fought my battles in the arena of work, of building, of out-performing. I didn't know how to fight against being slowly erased from my own daughter's life. The family reunion was Claire's idea, or so she said. Daniel thinks it would be great to bring everyone together. She told me over the phone. Get to know each other better, strengthen family bonds. I noticed the phrasing, Daniel thinks, not we thought, or I'd like. When had his preferences become the default, and her desires become invisible? But I agreed enthusiastically because I wanted to see her, wanted to be part of whatever vision of family she was building. When she asked about venues, I offered the estate immediately. Are you sure, Dad? We could rent somewhere else. We don't want to impose, but I insisted. What was the point of having this beautiful space if I couldn't share it with my own family? We settled on a date, and I began preparing months in advance. I wanted everything perfect. I supervised the landscaping personally, making sure the gardens were at their peak. I consulted with the catering team about menus, insisting on quality ingredients and attention to detail. I even had the gravel in the driveway raked in perfect lines, as if the stones themselves should reflect the care that went into this gathering. The week before the reunion, Claire called with an update. Daniel's handling most of the logistics. She said, he's really good at this kind of thing, organizing, managing details. I think he missed his calling as an event planner. She laughed, but there was something hollow in it. Should I coordinate with him then? I asked, about timing, setup, any special requirements. Oh, he's got it all under control. You don't need to worry about anything. Just show up and enjoy. Just show up. To my own property, for an event I was hosting, but I swallowed the observation and told her I was looking forward to it. The day arrived with weather that seemed designed for celebration. Clear skies, gentle breeze, temperature in that perfect range where you could sit outside for hours without discomfort. I dressed carefully, business casual, wanting to look presentable but not overdressed. I arrived early because it's my property and because old habits of checking details die hard. The catering team was already at work, transforming the grounds into something magical. String lights were being hung between trees, tables arranged in careful clusters, a bar being set up near the main patio. Everything looked exactly as I'd hoped. I walked through the space, feeling that particular satisfaction of seeing a vision realized. Daniel arrived an hour later, earlier than the stated start time, but clearly not early enough to have done any actual setup. He emerged from an expensive sedan wearing what probably cost more than my first car, sunglasses that stayed on despite being indoors, an air of ownership that would have been impressive if it weren't so misplaced. He saw me and offered a wave that somehow conveyed both acknowledgement and dismissal. Hey, looking good, he called out, and I wasn't sure if he meant me or the venue. He immediately began directing staff, the staff I'd hired, who knew me and knew the property. He changed arrangements, moved tables, adjusted the sound system, all while projecting an authority that suggested he'd created all of this himself. I watched from a distance, feeling increasingly invisible. When I approached to ask if he needed anything, he barely paused in his instructions to the catering manager. No, we're good. Everything's under control. As if he and the staff were a team, and I was an observer. Guests began arriving. Claire's friends, some relatives from Eleanor's side of the family, people I'd met over the years but didn't know well. Daniel greeted each arrival with expansive enthusiasm, playing the host with practiced charm. I stood near the entrance, smiling, expecting to greet people alongside him. but he positioned himself in a way that funneled everyone toward him, creating a receiving line of one. When I tried to join, he turned and said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "Let's get the old folks seated before they get tired, yeah." A few people laughed, nervous, polite laughter, the kind that acknowledges a joke without quite endorsing it. I felt my face flush, that particular heat of humiliation mixed with confusion. Had he really just said that? Was I old folks and now I'm 67, healthy, probably in better shape than half the people here. But in one sentence, he'd reduced me to a category, a demographic to be managed rather than a person to be respected. I could have objected, should have, probably. But the moment passed too quickly, and the social machinery moved on, and I found myself walking toward a table at the edge of the patio, under the oak tree, exactly where you'd seat someone you're obligated to include but prefer to forget. My sister Margaret found me there 20 minutes later. She's 3 years younger than me, but looks older. Life's been harder on her. 2 divorces and a son who can't seem to hold a job. But she's got Elinor's gift for seeing through bullshit. "What are you doing all the way over here?" she asked, sitting down without invitation. "Getting old, apparently." I said, trying to make it sound like a joke. She frowned. "What? Nothing. Just enjoying the party." She looked around, taking in the layout, the way I was positioned away from the main action. "Did that pompous son-in-law of yours put you in the corner?" "It's fine, Margaret. Don't make a thing of it. Making you invisible in your own house is already a thing, whether I comment on it or not." She stood up. "Come on. We're sitting closer to the action. I'm fine here. You're not fine. You're being sidelined, and I'll be damned if I'm going to watch my brother get treated like the help at his own event." We moved to a table closer to the center, though still not at the heart of things. Margaret made conversation, introduced me to people I'd already met, generally refused to let me disappear. I was grateful for her, for the reminder that at least one person still saw me clearly. But as the afternoon wore on, as Daniel continued to hold court, and Claire continued to orbit him like a moon with no light of its own, I felt something settling in my chest, not anger exactly, something colder, clearer, as the sun began setting, and the string lights created that particular magic of evening gatherings. Daniel called for everyone's attention. He stood in the center of the patio, glass raised, and launched into what I realized was a prepared speech. "I just want to thank everyone for coming," he began. "It means so much to Claire and me to have all of you here. Family is so important, especially in today's fast-paced world where we can lose touch so easily." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. He continued, talking about connection and tradition and values, all while standing on my property, eating food I'd arranged, surrounded by beauty I'd created. The irony was so thick I could taste it. Then he shifted topics, and I felt Margaret tense beside me. "You know, Claire and I were just talking about how different the world is from when our parents were young. The pace of change, the technology, the way we work and communicate. It's like we're living in a completely different universe." People nodded. Some of the younger guests were looking at their phones even while pretending to listen. "No offense," Daniel said, and my entire body tensed because nothing good ever follows those words. But old people just don't get it anymore. They're stuck in their ways, can't keep up with how fast things move now. Laughter. Not from everyone, but enough. Enough to sting. Enough to make me understand that this wasn't an accidental slight. This was his world. You, delivered with the confidence of someone who's never had to question his own relevance. I felt eyes on me. Pity, embarrassment, awkwardness. Claire was looking down, her face flushed. She knew. She knew he was talking about me, about her father, and she said nothing. Margaret grabbed my arm. "Don't," she whispered, though I hadn't moved. Not yet. Daniel continued his toast, eventually landing on some platitude about honoring the past while embracing the future, and everyone drank. I raised my glass with the others, but the wine tasted like ashes. I've spent most of my life building things, companies, relationships, principles. I started working at 14, lied about my age to get a job at a lumber yard. By 16, I was running crews twice my age because I showed up early, stayed late, and learned faster than anyone else. By 25, I had my own contracting business. By 35, I'd expanded into commercial development. By 45, I was consulting for companies larger than any I'd ever imagined owning. I've been through recessions that destroyed better men than me and came out standing. I've made payroll when it meant not paying myself for months. I've made decisions that affected hundreds of families, and I lost sleep over every one of them. I've been through wars, not the shooting kind, but the kind that happen in boardrooms and negotiation tables, where the weapons are words and the casualties are careers. I've survived betrayals by partners I trusted, economic collapses I didn't see coming, technological shifts that made my expertise obsolete, and forced me to learn new skills when most men my age were coasting toward retirement. I've made mistakes that cost me dearly and paid for them with years, not just regrets. I've buried friends, buried my wife, buried dreams I didn't even know I had until they were gone. And through all of it, I've maintained my principles, my integrity, my commitment to doing things right even when cutting corners would have been easier and more profitable. That's what 70 years on this planet earns you: perspective, wisdom, scars, and apparently the right to be dismissed as irrelevant by someone who's never built anything that might outlast his LinkedIn profile. But I didn't respond, not yet, because sometimes silence is more eloquent than anger, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait for exactly the right moment. The evening continued around me while I sat in that strange space of clarity that comes when humiliation burns away everything except truth. I watched Daniel work the crowd, watched Claire play supporting actress in his one-man show, watched all these people, family, supposedly, participate in my erasure without even realizing it was happening. I thought about Eleanor, about what she'd said in those final days. Let her fall sometimes. Maybe this was the fall. Maybe I'd been catching Claire for so long that she'd never learned to watch where she was stepping. Maybe by protecting her from every consequence, I'd raised someone who didn't recognize cruelty when it was being performed in her name. The music got louder as night deepened. Someone had connected a playlist to the sound system, and now bass was thumping across the carefully manicured lawn, destroying the elegant ambience I'd spent weeks creating. Young people were dancing, not badly, just enthusiastically, the way people do when they're not worried about how they look. Daniel was among them, drink in hand, Claire beside him, both of them laughing at something I couldn't hear and wouldn't understand even if I could. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting the movement. 70 years is a long time to carry a body around, and mine has the mileage to prove it. Margaret looked up at me. "Where are you going?" "For a walk," I said. "Need to stretch my legs. Want company?" "No, thank you. I just need a minute." I walked across the lawn, away from the music and the laughter and the casual dismissal of everything I'd built. The grass was slightly damp from the evening dew, and my shoes left dark impressions in the perfect green. In the distance, I could see the lights of the main house, the one I'd rebuilt from near collapse, the one that represented 2 years of my life and more money than I'd ever admit to spending. I thought about all the hours I'd spent here, the decisions made, the compromises rejected, the vision held firm until reality matched it. This place was mine in a way that went deeper than ownership. I'd literally shaped it with my choices, my standards, my refusal to settle for good enough when excellence was possible. And here was Daniel, treating it like he'd discovered it, like it existed for his benefit, like the man who'd created it was nothing more than an inconvenient ancestor to be patronized and dismissed. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Marcus's number. The event manager, a man I'd worked with for 3 years, who knew every inch of this property and knew me well enough to understand what I was about to ask. He answered on the first ring. "Everything okay, Mr. Sullivan?" That's what he called me, not buddy or old timer or sir. In that dismissive way Daniel said it, just my name with respect. "Marcus, I need you to do something for me." "Of course, what do you need?" "I need you to shut it down." Silence on the other end, long enough that I thought the connection had dropped. Sir, the party, I want it ended, now. Mr. Sullivan, there's still 2 hours left on the booking. There are almost 100 people here. I own this property, Marcus. The contract includes a clause allowing me to terminate any event at my discretion. I'm exercising that right. Another pause. I could hear him breathing, processing, probably wondering if I'd been drinking or if this was some kind of test. May I ask why? Because the host just gave a speech about how old people are irrelevant and can't keep up. On my property. At an event I'm hosting. And I've decided I don't need to subsidize my own humiliation. I heard something that might have been a suppressed laugh. Understood, sir. How do you want me to handle it? Professionally, no drama. Just begin shutdown procedures, music off first, then dim the house lights to normal levels, have the catering staff start clearing, make it obvious the event is concluding, and if people ask why, tell them the owner has revoked the venue access. If they push, they can take it up with me directly. This is going to create quite a scene, sir. Yes, I agreed, it is. I hung up and stood there in the darkness beyond the party lights, watching the celebration that was about to end. I felt calm, more calm than I'd felt in years, actually, because I'd made a decision and it was the right one, and I was done second, guessing myself to make other people comfortable. 60 seconds later, the music died. Not a fade out, just a sudden stop mid-song. I watched the dancing pause, saw people look around in confusion. Then the decorative string lights dimmed to about half brightness. Still enough to see by, but clearly no longer party ambience. That's when I started walking back toward the patio, timing my arrival carefully. The catering staff, bless them, were already in motion. They'd worked enough events to recognize shutdown mode, and they moved with practiced efficiency. Clearing glasses, folding linens, breaking down the bar, the universal signal that the party's over. I could see Daniel near the center of the patio, his face cycling through confusion to irritation to anger. He was gesturing at Marcus, who stood with his hands clasped professionally, nodding but not yielding. Claire was beside him, looking between Marcus and the staff, clearly trying to understand what was happening. I walked slowly, deliberately, giving everyone time to notice me, to track my movement across the lawn. Margaret saw me first, and her face broke into a grin that probably should have warned me I was about to do something irreversible. But I was past the point of reversibility. The crowd parted as I approached, conversations dying like embers in rain. By the time I reached the center of the patio, there was almost complete silence. Just the sound of glasses being collected, chairs being straightened, the mechanical noises of an event being deconstructed. Daniel turned to me, and I saw something I'd never seen before in his expression. Uncertainty. As if for the first time, he wasn't sure of his position. What's going on? He asked, trying to maintain his tone of command, but not quite achieving it. Why is the staff cleaning up? We have 2 more hours. I stopped about 10 feet from him, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough to make it clear this wasn't a private conversation. Evening, everyone, I said, and my voice carried in the quiet. I apologize for the interruption. There's been a change of plans. Murmurs, shuffling, the sound of people pulling out phones to check the time. You see, this venue is no longer available for this event. The owner has decided to terminate the booking. I let that sit for a moment, watched understanding dawn on different faces at different speeds. Daniel's face went from confused to disbelieving. You can't do that, he said, half statement, half question. There's a contract. We paid. The contract, I interrupted gently, includes a clause allowing the property owner to terminate any event at his sole discretion, with full refund of fees. It's rarely invoked, but it's there. I wrote it myself. Someone in the crowd, I think it was Margaret, laughed, not cruelly, just a short bark of surprised appreciation. Daniel's face was cycling through emotions faster than I could track them. You don't own this place. The rental company. I am the rental company, I said. Or more precisely, I own the property and contract with an events management company to handle bookings. But make no mistake, Daniel. Every blade of grass you're standing on, every light illuminating your party, Every square inch of this estate belongs to me. The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a leaf fall. Claire's face had gone pale. She was staring at me like she'd never seen me before, like I'd suddenly started speaking a language she didn't know I knew. Dad, her voice was small, uncertain. It broke my heart a little, but not enough to change course. I bought this property 5 years ago. I continued, speaking to the crowd now, not just Daniel. After your mother died, Claire, I was looking for a project, something to pour my energy into. I spent 2 years restoring it, learning about historical preservation, working alongside contractors to bring it back to what it once was. I gestured at the house, the gardens, the carefully curated beauty surrounding us. This place was a ruin, foreclosed, abandoned, dying. I gave it life again, the same way I built my business from nothing, the same way I built the life that gave my daughter every opportunity she's had. I looked at Daniel the same way my generation built most of what your generation takes for granted. He opened his mouth, closed it. For once, he had nothing to say. You gave a lovely speech earlier. I continued. About how old people don't get it anymore. How we're stuck in our ways. How we can't keep up. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Standing on my property, eating food I provided, surrounded by beauty I created, while dismissing the relevance of the man who made it all possible. Some of the older relatives started nodding. One of Elinor's cousins actually said, "Damn right," loud enough for people nearby to hear. So yes, Daniel, I'm terminating this event, not because I'm cruel, not because I don't love my daughter, but because I will not subsidize my own disrespect. Not anymore, not here, not anywhere. I turned to address the full crowd. I apologize to those of you who came here expecting a full evening. This is not your fault, and you're welcome to stay and finish your drinks, but the party, as such, is over. Marcus will coordinate with anyone who needs help with transportation or arrangements. I looked back at Daniel, who still seemed frozen in disbelief. You're welcome to stay and talk if you'd like, but the music's not coming back on. The lights aren't going back up. This particular celebration is finished. Then I did something I'd been wanting to do all evening. I turned my back on him and walked toward the house, not quickly, not dramatically, just a man heading home after making his position clear. Behind me, chaos erupted. Voices rising, people talking over each other, the sound of a social structure collapsing. I heard Claire call my name, but I didn't turn around, not yet. I needed this moment, this walk across my own property, this reclamation of space and dignity. I reached the house and went inside into the quiet, into the space that was mine alone. I poured myself a bourbon, the good stuff, the bottle I saved for significant moments, and stood by the window watching the party dissolve like sugar in water. People were gathering their things, some quickly like they couldn't wait to leave, others lingering in small groups, clearly dissecting what had just happened. I saw Daniel gesturing animatedly, probably trying to salvage something from the wreckage of his perfect event. I saw Claire standing alone, her arms wrapped around herself, looking lost. That image almost broke my resolve, almost sent me back outside to comfort her, to apologize, to make it all better the way I'd been doing her entire life. But I stayed where I was, because Elinor's voice was in my head, clear as if she were standing beside me. Let her fall sometimes. She needs to know she can get back up. The guests dispersed over the next 30 minutes. I watched cars pull out of the driveway, headlights cutting through the darkness, carrying away witnesses to my small rebellion. Margaret found me before she left. She came through the side door without knocking, found me still at the window. That, she said, was the most beautiful thing I've seen in years. I turned to look at her. She was grinning, her eyes bright with something between tears and laughter. Was it too much? I asked. Was it exactly enough? She corrected. That little shit has been condescending to all of us for years. Someone needed to remind him that he's not the center of the universe. I might have just destroyed my relationship with my daughter. You might have just saved it, she countered. She's been disappearing, you know. Every time I see her, there's less of her there. He's been erasing her the same way he's been erasing you. Maybe this is the wake-up call she needs. Or maybe I've just proven I'm the bitter old man he thinks I am. Margaret walked over and hugged me, fierce and tight. You're not bitter. You're done. There's a difference. She pulled back and looked me in the eyes. The world needs more old men who refuse to disappear quietly. You did good, brother. Don't second guess it. After she left, I stood alone in my house, earned and paid for and shaped by my hands, and waited. I knew Claire would come. The only question was when and what she'd say when she did. The knock came around 11. Soft, hesitant, not the confident knock of someone sure of their welcome. I opened the door. Claire stood there, still in her party dress, mascara slightly smudged, looking younger and more vulnerable than I'd seen her in years. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. We walked to the living room in silence. I sat in my chair, the one Elena and I had picked out together, worn to the exact shape of my body after years of use. Claire perched on the edge of the couch, hands twisting in her lap. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "You didn't have to do that." And I replied, "Maybe not, but I did. Dad, you humiliated him, in front of everyone, his friends, his colleagues, family. Do you have any idea how that looks?" I took a sip of my bourbon, considered my words carefully. I imagine it looks like a man who was disrespectful, finally experiencing a consequence for that disrespect. He wasn't being disrespectful, he was just. Just what, Claire? Just making jokes about how old people are irrelevant. Just treating me like I'm an inconvenient accessory to your life. Just dismissing everything I've built and everything I've learned because it happened before smartphones existed. She looked away. "You're being overly sensitive. He didn't mean it personally." Then who did he mean? Which old people was he dismissing? Because from where I was sitting, alone at the edge of the party, exactly where he told me to sit, it felt pretty personal. "Dad, do you remember when you were 7? I interrupted. "You came home from school crying because a girl in your class said you were stupid. Do you remember what I told you?" She blinked, thrown by the change in direction. "No. I told you that anyone who makes you feel small is really just trying to make themselves feel big, and that you should never, ever let someone else's insecurity become your truth." I leaned forward. "That's what Daniel's been doing, Claire, to me, to you, probably to everyone around him, making himself feel big by making everyone else feel small, and I'm done allowing it." Tears started falling down her face, silent and steady. "He's my husband, I know, and I'm your father, but you shouldn't have to choose between those relationships. The fact that you think you do tells me everything I need to know about how unhealthy this has become. What do you want me to do? Leave him? I want you to demand respect. I want you to stop shrinking yourself to make him comfortable. I want you to remember that you're the daughter of Elena and me, two people who built everything from nothing and never apologized for taking up space." She was crying harder now. "I don't know how to do that." "Yes, you do. You just forgot. Because I made everything too easy. Because I solved all your problems before you had to face them. Because I loved you so much that I accidentally taught you that love means sacrifice instead of partnership." I set down my glass and moved to sit beside her on the couch. "Your mother tried to warn me. In her last days, she told me to let you fall sometimes, to let you learn your own strength. I didn't understand what she meant then, but I think this is it. This is the fall, and sweetheart, you need to figure out if you can get back up." She turned to me, her face a mess of tears and confusion. "I don't want to lose you." "Then don't. I'm right here. I've always been here, but I won't be invisible anymore. I won't accept disrespect in silence just to keep the peace. That's not love, Claire. That's just fear dressed up as family loyalty." We sat there together as she cried, and I held her the way I had when she was small, and for the first time in years, it felt like I was actually reaching her. Not the polished, professional version she'd become, but the real person underneath. When her tears finally slowed, she pulled back and wiped her face. "He's going to be so angry. Let him be angry. His anger is his responsibility, not yours to manage. Everything's going to change. Everything already changed, honey. This is just the first time you're seeing it clearly." She stood up slowly, like someone testing legs after a long illness. At the door, she paused. I don't know what happens next. Neither do I. I admitted. But I know you're strong enough to figure it out. You're Eleanor's daughter. You've got more strength in you than you've been allowed to use. She nodded, hugged me briefly, and left. I watched her walk to her car, saw her sit in the driver's seat for a long moment before starting the engine. Then she was gone, and I was alone again. But this time, the solitude felt different. Not like abandonment, but like space, room to breathe. The freedom that comes from finally speaking truth after years of swallowing it. The days that followed were predictably chaotic. My phone exploded with messages, some supportive, many critical, all wanting to discuss what had happened. I ignored most of them. Margaret called daily with updates from the family gossip network. Apparently, I was either a hero or a monster, depending on who you asked, with very little middle ground. Daniel's parents sent a scathing email about my disrespectful behavior and public humiliation of their son. I deleted it without responding. Several of Claire's friends reached out, some to criticize, others to quietly admit they'd always found Daniel arrogant. I thanked the latter and ignored the former. The local events community buzzed with the story, apparently shutting down your own daughter's party makes for good gossip. Marcus called to make sure I was okay and to tell me that several potential clients had specifically requested to book the estate because they liked an owner with standards. The world, it seemed, was divided on whether I'd been justified or cruel. I found I didn't particularly care about the verdict. Claire didn't call for 6 days, the longest we'd gone without contact since Eleanor died. I forced myself not to reach out, not to apologize, not to smooth everything over the way I'd always done. This needed to be her decision, her move, her choice about what kind of relationship she wanted with me. When she finally called, her voice sounded different, steadier maybe. Can we talk? In person? We met at a coffee shop halfway between us, neutral territory. She looked tired, like she hadn't been sleeping well. We ordered drinks and sat by the window, watching traffic pass. I've been doing a lot of thinking. She began, about what you said, about Daniel, about me, about everything. I waited, giving her space to find her words. You were right, about a lot of it. I have been shrinking. I didn't even realize it was happening. It was so gradual, just little compromises here and there, until I looked up one day and barely recognized myself. She stirred her coffee, not drinking it. I talked to Daniel, really talked, not just the surface conversations we usually have. I told him what you said, how you felt, how I've been feeling, if I'm honest. How'd he take it? Not well. He thinks you're manipulating me, that you're jealous of our relationship, that you can't stand seeing me happy with someone else. She looked up. But here's the thing. I'm not that happy. I haven't been for a while. I just kept telling myself I was, because admitting otherwise would mean I made a mistake. Marriage is work. I said carefully. Every relationship has hard periods. Your mother and I had our share. But did Mom ever make you feel small? Did she ever dismiss what you'd accomplished or treat your experience like it was worthless? I thought about Eleanor, about our decades together, about the fights and the reconciliations and the deep respect that underlay even our worst moments. Never, I said honestly. We disagreed, sometimes loudly, but she never diminished me, and I never diminished her. Claire nodded slowly. I asked Daniel to go to couples therapy, to work on our communication, our respect for each other, to build something better. And he said therapy is for people who can't handle their own problems, that if I just stop listening to you and focus on our marriage, everything would be fine. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. He actually said that, if I'd stopped listening to my father, our problems would solve themselves. That tells you something important. I said gently. What? That he sees me as the problem, not his behavior, not his disrespect, but my refusal to accept it silently. Anyone who sees your boundaries as the enemy isn't going to respect those boundaries. We sat in silence for a while, drinking our coffee, watching the world move past the window. Finally, Claire said, I'm not ready to leave him, not yet. but I'm not going to keep apologizing for having a relationship with you either. I told him that you're my father, that you're part of my life, and that's non-negotiable. How'd he respond? He's giving me the silent treatment, sleeping in the guest room, acting like a wounded child instead of a grown man. She smiled ruefully, kind of proving your point. Actually, what are you going to do? I don't know yet, but I know I'm done making myself small. If that means my marriage changes or ends, then that's what happens. Because you were right, Dad. Love without respect isn't love. It's just fear dressed up as commitment. I reached across the table and took her hand. Whatever you decide, whatever you need, I'm here, not to tell you what to do, but to support you while you figure it out yourself. Even if I stay with him, even then, though I hope you'll demand better treatment if you do, I will. She said, and for the first time in years, I believed she meant it. Over the following months, I watched Claire rediscover her spine. It wasn't a straight line. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, times when the old patterns almost reasserted themselves. But something had shifted in her, some core of strength that had been buried under years of conflict, avoidance, and people pleasing. She set boundaries with Daniel. Some he accepted, grudgingly. Others he fought, and I watched her hold firm in ways that must have cost her dearly. She started seeing a therapist on her own, working through questions about identity and worth and what she wanted from her life. She called me more regularly, and our conversations grew deeper. We talked about Elinor, about the early days of their marriage, about the struggles I'd never told her about because I was trying to protect her from the weight of them. You made it look easy, she said once. Building the business, the marriage, everything, I thought that's how it was supposed to be effortless. Nothing worthwhile is effortless. I told her, your mother and I worked hard at our marriage every single day. The difference is we were working together, not against each other. She nodded, absorbing that. I think that's what I'm missing. The partnership. With Daniel, it feels like I'm working for the marriage, not in it. That's the difference between building something together and being an employee in someone else's vision. I said. 3 months after the reunion, Claire showed up at the estate unannounced. I was in the garden doing some late-season pruning when I heard her car in the drive. She got out looking lighter somehow, like she'd set down weight I hadn't even realized she was carrying. I left him, she said without preamble. Not permanently, not yet. But I'm staying in a hotel for a while. I needed space to think, to figure out who I am without his voice in my head telling me who I should be. I put down my pruning shears and hugged her. How are you feeling? Terrified, relieved, sad, angry, free? She laughed, all of it at once. That sounds about right. Can I ask you something? Anything? Do you regret it? Shutting down the party? All the drama it caused? I thought about it, really considered the question. No, I said finally. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that our relationship had deteriorated to the point where that was the only way to make myself heard, but the act itself, no, I'd do it again. Good, she said. Because I don't regret it either. It was the wake-up call I needed. As humiliating as it was in the moment, it forced me to see clearly, and I needed that. We spent the afternoon together, working in the garden, talking about everything and nothing. At one point, she asked, do you get lonely? Out here by yourself? Sometimes, I admitted, but there's a difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is feeling empty when you're alone. Solitude is feeling complete. I've learned to appreciate the difference. Teach me, she said. Teach you what? How to be complete on my own. How to find dignity in standing alone if that's what it takes. How to be strong the way you are, the way Mom was. You already know how. I told her. You just forgot for a while, but you're remembering, I can see it. She smiled, and in that smile I saw Elinor, the determination, the quiet strength, the refusal to settle for less than what she deserved. Thank you, Claire said, for shutting down the party, for refusing to be invisible, for showing me what it looks like to choose yourself even when it costs you something. It cost me nothing I wasn't willing to lose, I said. And it gained me back my daughter. That's a trade I'd make every time. As the sun set over the estate that evening, casting gold light across the gardens I'd built and the house I'd restored, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: contentment. Not happiness exactly, because the situation was still complicated and painful and uncertain, but contentment. The deep satisfaction of knowing I'd acted according to my principles, of standing firm when it would have been easier to bend, of choosing dignity over comfort. Claire stayed for dinner, and we ate on the patio where the party had been held months before. The string lights were off, the space quiet, but it felt peaceful rather than empty. I might sell my part of the business, Claire said over dessert. Start fresh, maybe do something completely different. I've been so busy climbing the ladder, I never stopped to ask if it was leaning against the right wall. Your mother would love that, I said. The questioning, not necessarily the quitting. She always said the unexamined career isn't worth having. What about you? What do you think? I think you're the only one who can answer what's right for you. But I also think that any decision made from a place of strength and clarity is going to be better than one made from fear or obligation. She nodded, thoughtful. I'm not going to rush anything, with Daniel, with work, with any of it. I'm just going to sit in this space for a while and see what emerges. That might be the wisest thing I've heard you say in years. We sat in comfortable silence as night deepened around us, and I thought about time, about legacy, about what we leave behind. The estate would outlive me. The businesses I'd built would evolve beyond my involvement. The lessons I'd learned would hopefully pass to Claire and eventually to her children if she had them. But more than any physical legacy, what mattered was this: that I'd stood up when it mattered, that I'd refused to accept disrespect, that I'd shown my daughter what dignity looked like even when it cost something. Because that's what the old generation owes the young, not perfect examples, but honest ones, not lives without struggle, but demonstrations of how to struggle with integrity, not the absence of hard choices, but the courage to make them and live with the consequences. Daniel's arrogance wasn't unusual. It was cultural. Western society worships youth in a way that's both understandable and deeply damaging. We talk about progress, innovation, disruption, all code words for the belief that new is inherently better than old. We confuse the speed of technological change with the pace of human wisdom, as if having the latest smartphone somehow makes you smarter than people who built civilizations with pen and paper. But the truth is that most of what sustains civilization was built by hands now wrinkled and slow. The legal systems, the infrastructure, the institutions, the accumulated knowledge that makes modern life possible, all of it came from people who are now dismissed as old or dead. We stand on the shoulders of giants and then mock them for being shorter than we are because we can't see the foundation they provide. The bridges we drive across were designed by engineers who retired decades ago. The buildings we work in were constructed according to codes developed through years of catastrophic failures our generation didn't have to experience. The rights we take for granted were fought for by activists who are now elderly or gone. Every convenience, every freedom, every innovation builds on countless unseen contributions from people who had the audacity to exist before the internet. And yet we've created a culture that treats age as an expiration date on relevance, that measures worth by novelty rather than substance, that confuses motion with progress and noise with significance. It's not just disrespectful, it's suicidal, because in dismissing the wisdom of age, we're dooming ourselves to repeat mistakes that were already solved, to relearn lessons that were already taught, to rebuild foundations that were already solid. I realized that night that I wasn't angry at Daniel personally. I was angry at a culture that raised him to believe that his youth was a credential, his energy a substitute for experience, his comfort with technology a replacement for wisdom. I was angry at a world that taught my daughter to shrink herself to fit into someone else's vision, rather than demanding space for her own. I was angry at the collective amnesia that makes each generation think they invented struggle, discovered truth, pioneered independence, as if human nature itself evolved when they were born. But anger, I'd learned, is only useful if it leads to action. And my action was simple: refused to participate in my own erasure, not with violence, not with bitterness, but with the quiet certainty that I had value regardless of whether anyone else recognized it. That's what shutting down the party really meant. Not revenge, not spite, but reclamation. Taking back my space, my dignity, my right to exist without apology, reminding everyone present, but mostly reminding myself, that I wasn't a relic or a burden or an obstacle to be managed. I was a human being with experience, wisdom, and the fundamental right to be treated with respect. The weeks after Claire's visit brought unexpected changes. Word of what happened at the reunion spread wider than I'd anticipated, and the responses were more varied than I could have imagined. Several old colleagues reached out, men my age who'd felt similarly dismissed in their own families and workplaces. We started meeting monthly for dinner, calling ourselves the Obsolete Gentlemen's Club with tongue firmly in cheek. We'd share stories, offer support, remind each other that experience has value even when youth can't see it. One of them, Robert, had been forced into early retirement by a company he'd helped build. They wanted fresh perspectives, he said bitterly, as if my 30 years of keeping them profitable during 3 recessions was stale. Another, William, had similar family troubles. His son-in-law had taken over the family business and immediately started changing everything William had built, dismissing his input as old school thinking that doesn't apply anymore. I wanted to tell him that fundamentals never go out of style, William said. That you can't disrupt your way out of basic economics. But he wouldn't listen. Now the business is struggling, and he still won't admit that maybe I knew what I was talking about. These conversations were therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected, not because misery loves company, but because witnessing others' struggles gave context to my own. This wasn't personal failure or individual weakness. It was a generational phenomenon, a cultural shift that left many men my age feeling obsolete despite having decades of valuable experience. But there were positive responses too. Several younger people reached out with messages of support. I wish someone would call out my boss like this. One wrote, he treats everyone over 50 like they're mentally declining. Another said, my grandfather saw your story and started standing up to my uncle, who's been treating him like an inconvenience. Thank you for showing him it's okay to demand respect. Those messages surprised me. I'd assumed the young would universally side with Daniel, would see me as the unreasonable old man who couldn't adapt to changing times. But many of them had their own experiences with arrogance masquerading as confidence, with dismissiveness packaged as progress. They recognized the dynamic even if they were on different sides of it. Marcus, my event manager, told me bookings at the estate had actually increased. Apparently, people appreciate an owner who has standards, he said. We've had 3 couples specifically mention that they want their weddings at the place where that guy stood up for himself. You've become accidentally famous, or accidentally infamous, I suggested. Either way, it's good for business. Claire and Daniel tried couples therapy after all. She told me he'd agreed reluctantly, framing it as something I'm doing for Claire. Rather than work they were doing together. Not a promising start. I observed. No, she agreed. But I told him it was therapy or separation. He chose therapy. The sessions were apparently difficult. The therapist, according to Claire, quickly identified the core issue Daniel's need for control and admiration, and the way he'd structured their relationship to meet those needs at Claire's expense. She asked him why he needed me to be smaller. Claire told me after one session. He couldn't answer. He just kept saying that wasn't what he was doing, that I was being oversensitive. She pointed out that dismissing my feelings was exactly the behavior we were there to address. Is he getting it, understanding the patterns? I don't know. He's defensive most of the time, but there are moments